My interest in this topic of a fourth order in the Franciscan tradition started many years ago when I was talking to someone at a conference. I'd just given a paper on lay preaching on Rosa Viterbo, and the scholar wanted to discuss some aspect of the argument, but she started off wanting to get to know more about me, and she asked me what religious congregation I belonged to. When I said I wasn't in a congregation, she said, "Oh, you're a secular." When I denied that too, she said, "Oh, I thought you were a real Franciscan." Now, I could have let that go, but many of you know me. So I said, "I thought I was a real Franciscan." But she disagreed. "No, but you're a Franciscan-hearted person." Years later, a different scholar at a different conference greeted me heartily. "Hey, there's my favorite fourth order Franciscan." Now, it's a term I personally struggle with, but this time I let it go. There's no reason to get into a heady conversation over history, identity, and tradition at the registration desk in a lobby of a hotel. But tonight's a different story. I know my own experiences are not unique. Several people have shared with me experiences similar to mine. Now, some embrace the phrase fourth order since they feel it legitimizes their sense of identity in this tradition. Some don't mind being called Franciscan-hearted to distinguish themselves and their identity from those who have made vows or professions in one of the orders. But the use of both phrases comes with assumptions that warrant examination. So I'm grateful for this opportunity tonight to start a conversation around these terms, not to definitively determine their use, but more importantly, to put a spotlight on some of the unnamed assumptions that support their use, and to add depth, especially to the lived experience of faith in the Franciscan tradition that might nuance the tendency to privilege association with an order as more authentic than a life of faith merely lived out without official affiliation. As we move through the 21st century with demographic changes to institutional religious life that are beginning to take place, this question of who is Franciscan and who carries the charism into the future lurks. For some, the future rests with those called the fourth order. So let's get to it. What is meant by this term? Who makes up the so-called order? And is this the right term to be using? Saint Francis is, in all likelihood, the most revered and beloved Christian saint throughout the world. Admirers are found in many cultures and are practitioners of different faiths, including agnostics and atheists. I'm actually starting a series of informal conversations on my YouTube channel with some of these practitioners to start noticing differences and similarities around those people who adopt this charism as their own. But there is a tendency to lump this large, disparate group of fans and supporters together to acknowledge their existence and their potential role in furthering the Franciscan tradition. In recent years, it has become rather standard to call this group the Fourth Order. But the phrase is not new at all. The phrase Fourth Order has been around at least since 1938, when Ernest Raymond used it in his book, In the Steps of Francis, to refer to unofficial Franciscans, meaning people who were not vowed members of the Franciscan order, but who were attracted to the saint from Assisi. In 1999, in a short book entitled Poverty and Joy, the Franciscan Tradition, our colleague Bill Short used it to refer to the generations of scholars and others from the 19th century on who added significantly to the scholarship of the order and the tradition more generally. For many of them, their academic work grew out of a personal interest in the tradition without being affiliated or professed members of the order. But more recently, others have started using the term to refer more to practitioners, spiritual and otherwise, who might be carriers of the charism into the future. For example, Brian McLaren and Patrick Harlan use the phrase in making a case for what they call a Franciscan Renaissance, and made their pitch not only to the Franciscan community, which has welcomed them, but also the broad interfaith world of spiritual practitioners who they name as including Muslims, Jews, Hindus, and even atheists who have a deep respect for Francis his life, and his work. It's interesting they don't mention Buddhists, but that's aside. They conclude, quote, a Franciscan Renaissance will expand beyond the traditional three orders to a fourth order of Franciscan-hearted people, unquote. Their call for a Franciscan Renaissance is inspired by the world's crises in the ecological well-being of the earth and creation, the crises of peace and civil comportment, and the crises of economic well-being with the growing disparity of wealth separating the wealthy and the struggling poor. They argue, quote, we could wish that the leaders of our Christian faith were paying attention to these crises. A few are, but too many are obsessed with preserving their power, protecting their privilege, and perpetuating their institutions. McLaren and Carolyn call for this Franciscan Renaissance as the antidote to this dire situation. They clarify their use of the term as not referring to otherworldly piety and escapist rituals, that's their term, or propping up the status quo of Franciscan institutions. Again, that's their term. Rather, they advocate a Franciscan Renaissance centered on the spirit of St. Clare and Francis, embodied in their examples, further explored in the works of brilliant theologians like Blessed John Duns Scotus, unquote. In short, they base their understanding of the Franciscan tradition on the lives of vowed religious, namely Francis and Clare, and clerical male theologians. But in their plea for a revival of a spiritual practice and outlook that can address the world's crises, they overlook the contributions of the very practitioners of the tradition they hope they will embrace their call for Renaissance, namely the unaffiliated laity. Now, it happens often enough. After all, we've been trained to overlook the lived experience of laity and their contributions to this tradition. So let's look a little deeper. At the heart of this presentation is a basic question I've been asking for years. What does it mean to be Franciscan? We know the term was not used in the 13th century. Instead, practitioners of the larger evangelical awakening that Francis of Assisi and Clare of Assisi participated in were called penitents. There have been recent academic efforts to find more appropriate terms, such as mendicants. But since the literature, both the scholarly and popular literature, use the term Franciscan to apply to those who practice their faith within the ambient of the friars especially, and increasingly used to apply equally to those who practice their faith in the ambient of the Poor Clare sisters, and eventually those lay people associated with the Third Order, I also use this term, Franciscan. It is the one that is most readily understood today. So what does it mean to be Franciscan? And how do we know? Behind those questions are whose history counts as Franciscan and who gets to decide. In addition to just bringing credible attention to the many unnamed and overlooked lay people who have lived, prayed, and found their spiritual journey within this charism, this presentation also considers the academic disciplines that scholars have traditionally used to explain this tradition and puts a spotlight on the gaps and biases inherent in these methods of knowing. Now, after decades of study and observation, I've come to understand why so many lay people get left out of the curriculum of formation programs, academic history classes, and everyday mass sermons and adult education. Without some membership that retains records about us, or someone who champions our role, most laity are forgotten in time and overlooked in life. What is lost is valuable. It's nothing less than authentic faith lived out in daily life. So a careful look at both the current practices and the way historical and theological scholarship continues to marginalize lay voices and lay lived experience warrants our examination and reflection. But where should we begin? Before Francis, there was Jesus. Don't worry, I'm not gonna go 2,000 years into this. But before Francis, there was Jesus, who walked and talked a countercultural way of life. His path was from the beginning one of vulnerability rather than one of power. Francis eventually took up this path, but he was not without predecessors. We can often forget that before Francis, there were many people who go unnamed in sources who sought to live as Jesus taught, who sought to live in the footsteps of Jesus. This movement, called either the Vita Evangelica or the Vita Apostolica of the 12th century, was formed by many people, laity and clerics, who aspired to live according to the Gospels, which they were reading or having read to them. What made Francis different from his contemporaries and those who came before was the ecclesial support and promotion within clearly worked out rules, eventually confirmed with the papal seal in late November of 1223. This created an administrative and juridical framework to begin noting who was in and who was out of the fold. But different from Francis's own letter to the faithful addressed to, quote unquote, all Christian people, clergy and laity, men and women, and all who live in the world. There is, of course, scholarly debate about who Francis was really addressing in that letter. But like all of these debates, there's an underlying concern with who is in and who is out of the fold. So it is noteworthy to remember that after the rule of 1223 received papal approval, Francis left Rome and made his way to Greccio. Now, by all accounts, he was disappointed in the new legalistic rule. He was depressed. Concerned about the future of the mendicant life he sought to create for himself and companions. So he sought the solace of lay people he knew to be faithful. The people of Greccio had come to know Francis, and Francis, the people of Greccio. They greeted Francis warmly and responded with faith when he suggested they recreate or commemorate the birth of Jesus in a new way. Now, only one of this community is mentioned in the hagiographic sources, and that's John, the wealthy nobleman whose friendship with Francis led him to give land for a hermitage in that place. And in this particular story, facilitated the organization of this first living nativity that has become so famous and replicated today, occasionally in live renderings, but more frequently in simple figurines like ones we might have in our home, or detailed dioramas like this one found in the Piazza of St. Peter's in Rome. These static renderings help to remind us that what can be glossed over too quickly from the texts we rely on, and that is the faith and the support of the people of Greccio. From other sources, we know that the people of this small town, this hamlet, were particularly devout in their faith. They formed what we might call faith-sharing groups who met in their homes. The home as a place of prayer and devotion was further created with home altars and spaces dedicated to personal and family prayer. Francis was so taken by the faith of the people there. He chose that community to find solace and comfort in a time of doubt and disappointment. He chose that community of faithful, largely unnamed people to help him create a new buoyant way to enter into the spirit of the incarnation. Were the people of Greccio Franciscan? We can so easily overlook their presence, their meaningful support to Francis, especially at this time of doubt, and their dedicated faith because the sources largely overlook them. But it was to these unnamed people that Francis turned to be buoyed in his faith. Celano begins his account of the story with Francis's inner state. Quote, Francis's highest aim, foremost desire, and greatest intention was to pay heed to the holy gospel in all things and through all things, to follow the teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ, and to retrace his footsteps completely with all vigilance and all zeal, all the desire of his soul and all the fervor of his heart. Celano continues, indeed, so thoroughly did the humility of the incarnation and the charity of the passion occupy his memory, that they scarcely wanted to think of anything else, unquote. Such was the state of Francis's mind and heart. Dedicated to retracing Christ's footsteps, Francis considered recreating a living nativity to celebrate Jesus's birth. Without his good friend John, a man who knew how to get things done in the real world, Francis's hope and aspiration to experience consolation in a faithful recreation of the incarnation would have likely remained silent. A silent prayer and thought in solitude in his cell. As Bill Short has often said, Francis couldn't organize lint in his pocket. Organizing a living nativity was beyond his capacity, but it was not beyond John's. According to Celano, in mid-December, 15 days before Christmas, Francis summoned John and told him his hope for celebrating the incarnation. He wanted to have a living nativity scene, complete with animals, hay, a manger. He wanted to see, touch, and smell all that there was to sense in the incarnation of Christ in an animal's food trough. Just as Francis himself was experiencing discomfort and anguish, both physical and emotional, he wanted to share in the experience of the baby Jesus. He knew that it would be through a visceral engagement, using all of his senses, that he would find solace, hope, and compassion. Although he usually sought solitude, he asked to experience this within this community, and he asked his friend John to make it happen. Celano offers little detail about the work that John and others in the town brought to this task. Instead, Celano tells us that, quote, when the day of joy had arrived, Francis found all the things had been prepared. The manger is prepared, the hay is carried in, and the oxen and the ass are led to the spot. Out of Greccio is made a new Bethlehem. You notice what happened there? Did you notice the passive voice used in this passage? See how easy it is to gloss over the work and faith of laity? None of the work involved in preparing for this is mentioned. None of the planning nor the collaboration of so many people, including their time, energy, and prayers, is mentioned. So it's easy to overlook and forget the integral role unnamed lay people had in creating this important event. As people gathered with their candles and torches, lighting up the night and taking the chill off the winter's cold, there emerged among those present an even deeper awareness of connection and interdependence. There, along with the recognizable sounds of the snorts and munching of the animals, the familiar smells of candle wax mixed with animal dung, there grew a shared anticipation. If we bring this awareness to the text. In one of the most poignant passages in Christian literature, pointing to the interconnectedness of all creation, Celano writes, "The night is lit up like day, delighting both man and beast." And then shifting to the active voice, he continues, "The people arrive ecstatic at this new mystery of new joy. The forest amplifies the cries and the boulders echo back the joyful crowd. The brothers sing, giving God due praise, and the whole night abounds with jubilation." With this energized setting in which people, animals, forests, and boulders are all active participants, Francis, the poor man from Assisi, who so frequently sought solitude, stood before the manger and uttered heartfelt sighs. Now, if you have ever helped create a Christmas pageant in your parish, or even attended a Christmas pageant, consider for a moment the time, skill, energy, and faith that went into it. This is what gets lost in traditional historical analysis of sources, created for administrative, ecclesial, and even saint-making purposes. The historical sources that exist were written and preserved in order to create a container for the faith. But the real faith of the people runs deeper than most historical sources reveal. We can forget that if we aren't reminded to look for the unnamed people in texts and images and bring them to mind. Here they are in the background of the fresco of the cave fresco at Greccio. That this fresco helps us to remember their actions, work, prayers, and faith that so easily and routinely get subsumed by the passive voice, if they're even referenced at all. I always ask my students to cultivate a curiosity about who is not mentioned in sources. Should we call these unnamed people members of the Fourth Order? There's no evidence of any formal association, with the exception of their faith and support for Francis's vision of bringing to life the incarnational faith they shared. Does the phrase Franciscan-hearted people fully explain their commitment of faith? Or can we use the term lay Franciscans that points to their commitment and relationship with Francis while still acknowledging their lay status? My own preference is the latter. Another practitioner of faith who can get overlooked, except on the Feast of the Transitus, is Lady Jacoba, most commonly remembered for the cookies she baked for Francis. There is no evidence at all that she was a member of any order affiliated with him, and yet she was the closest of companions. There is no competition here among his companions, so there's no need to make a comparison to Clare. Instead, it is important to see how her role in supporting Francis and living out the gospel faith has been excised from the traditional sources and needs special attention to appreciate her role as a Franciscan. From financial and legal records, we know that this noblewoman retained control of the estate after her husband's death around 1211. With a financial and social independence that was not uncommon among Roman noblewomen, Jacoba administered the family's estate. She refused to cede control to her sons, even upon their reaching adulthood. And independently, she entered into a peace negotiation with the papacy, which had been a traditional enemy of her family. With her control over financial resources, she founded a hospital where the Church of San Francesco a Ripa stands now in Trastevere, and there she cared for the poor, the ill, and the dying alongside Francis when he was in Rome. In time, she was the major benefactor for the building of the Church of San Francesco in Assisi, and as we know, she is the only lay person buried there, now resting in the crypt, somewhat near Francis and his companions. But we know more about these bequests than we know about Jacoba's actual lived experience of faith, including caregiving, since those were never written down. But if you have ever cared for someone who is ill, aged, or dying, you know the kind of attention that is warranted, as well as the kind of personal reflection on vulnerability, mercy, and grace that arises from bearing witness while washing, holding, and soothing someone's body. Now, I spoke about this in an earlier Zoom lecture, specifically on caregiving a couple of years ago, but it's worth repeating that this capacity to bear witness to suffering and sharing that witness can create strong bonds, as we find some evidence for between Francis and Jacoba. But we have to know to look for it. As I have written in some of my published work, there are just 5 hagiographic accounts of Francis that mention Jacoba at his deathbed. The most significant and the most detailed is that by Thomas of Celano in the treatise on the miracles. Notably, Bonaventure did not include this account in his life of Francis. He tried to excise it from the tradition. The 5 accounts are mostly brief, with Celano's being the most extensive, as I just mentioned. But even his account is reserved in details of the kind of care that would have been a woman's role at the side of a dying man. We know that she brought with her all of the things that would have been needed to care for him, like a pillow, a blanket, and yes, the cookie ingredients. She also brought with her what would be needed after he died, since the preparation for the body for burial was also women's work: a shroud, candles, incense. While care is taken to protect the reputations of both Francis and Jacoba from any accusations or assumptions of impropriety, there is an implicit suggestion of intimacy between the two of them in Francis's final request to have her with him, and in Jacoba's intuition with her presence was needed. So, was Lady Jacoba a lay Franciscan? After all, she was the one Francis wanted to be with him as he was dying. But there is no evidence that she was a member of any order of any kind. She is certainly getting attention now as a Franciscan practitioner. There are several novels and short biographical treatments being published, especially in Italian. And in this new icon was recently commissioned by the Fraternity of Secular Franciscans at San Francesco Aripa in Rome. But piecing her story together and resurrecting it for our use and awareness today has taken some doing. Without institutional and ecclesial interest in her role in the tradition, it has taken the focused attention of scholars and lay practitioners to come to appreciate how she carved out a life of faith through her experience of involuntary loss and presence with those people on the margins of Roman society, especially the ill and the dying. And she did that often in the company of Francis, who shared in the service to the poor. In these two examples, namely the community of unnamed Christians in Greccio and this noblewoman, Lady Jacoba, we encounter people who practice their faith alongside Francis, not merely taking directives from him, but supporting him in his own doubts and serving beside him in the care of others. This openness to relationality attracts many new adherents today. These are the people who lived into a faith of ongoing transformation, becoming more deeply aware of the mystery of the incarnation through varied and disparate experience of vulnerability, involuntary loss, and mutual care. They didn't just learn from Francis. Francis learned from them too. Their faith was shared and mutually transformational. Now, there are many other examples, both contemporaries of Francis and after, but I wanted to start with these two just to put some flesh on this analysis before turning to the final parts of this talk. Who qualifies as a lay Franciscan? Habitually, many assume that to be a lay Franciscan, one necessarily belongs to the third order, known as the secular order today. But we know that the Franciscan path developed and institutionalized over time through ecclesial, especially papal intervention. This kind of administrative intervention to clarify and regularize Franciscan life gave way to the kind of documentation scholars readily use to map out institutional history. Historians such as Raffaele Pezzelli, Robert Stewart, Alison Moore, Giovanna Casagrande, and others use administrative and canonical texts as a way to tell the story of lay Franciscans. This tendency has found its way into formation materials that focus on the institutionalization of a way of life, rather than on the lived experience of faith of actual laity in the early period. In a particularly noteworthy study on the third order rule, Jean-François Godet-Calagueras has joined others and argued that the lay order did not exist prior to 1289, when Pope Nicholas IV issued Supramontem, addressed to the brothers and sisters of the Order of Penance. This papal document established the order canonically and for the first time attributed its foundation to Francis of Assisi. Godet-Calagueras meticulously traces the incremental ecclesial and papal efforts to bring juridical form to a lived experience of the penitential movement. He did so, noting how these juridical interventions fundamentally changed the lived experience of the penitents, from instruments of Christian love, care, and peace, into knights in the army of the church. Of course, there is no clear documentation affirming that Francis intended to found such a lay order, despite Celano and Julian of Speier's subsequent assertions in historiography. Francis used the Gospels as his guiding principles to create a brotherhood. And in his final parting words from the Testament, these words are often cited as proof of his modest institutional intentions and the profound spiritual purpose he found through unexpected transformation in communion with the most marginalized of people, lepers. The well-known words that open the Testament remind us of Francis's focus. The Lord gave me, Brother Francis, to begin to do penance in this way. While I was in sin, it seemed excessively bitter to me to see lepers. And the Lord himself led me among them, and I did mercy with them. When I left them, that which had seemed bitter to me had changed into sweetness of spirit and body. Doing penance and doing works of mercy, facere misericordia, were the crux of his personal transformation and ongoing conversion through relationship with people and all of creation. The institutionalization that was imposed both on the fraternity of brothers, the form of life taken up by Clare and her sisters, and later the creation of the Third Order by Nicholas IV, while not inconsequential, do not speak to the real lived experience of practitioners in the tradition. For this reason, I balk at references to a fourth order to convey any significant meaning to a disparate group of people who aspire to live into the tradition of presence, mercy, and ongoing transformation through relationality, modeled not just by Francis and Clare, and not just written by clerical theological tracts, but also by the stories of laity, whose lives of faith we take the time to engage in as models both in the past and today. So to conclude, why does any of this matter? That's a question all scholars need to ask themselves. For me, knowing that in the 21st century, many religious congregations are facing demographic decline, it's important to notice and acknowledge how the Franciscan charism is being held and carried by a wider range of people, including laity, and that it has attracted admiration and respect from practitioners of various faiths. This isn't a novelty. This is the tradition. The charism has been carved out and championed by many people, vowed, professed, and dedicated faithful. Tonight, I looked at two examples of these dedicated faithful, since those of us who are in this category often fly under the radar of recognition by others. But with real engagement, we are seen as contributing members of the tradition, because increasingly there is growing awareness that there is a rich and long tradition of dedicated laity actively living this charism and spreading awareness of it widely. I'll close with a very short anecdote that gives me hope. Over breakfast several weeks ago, I was chatting with a friar who was explaining to me how laity just don't understand the Franciscan way. I listened with care, and I asked him to explain his position. After some amount of time, I finally admitted, well, I'm a lay person. Oh, I thought you were a sister. You must be a secular. No, I'm just trying to live a Franciscan life, I said. I consider myself a lay Franciscan. He was quiet for a minute, thinking over what I had said. He smiled and just said, a lay Franciscan. Thank you. Oh, I want to finish with just this brief little image sent to me by another lay Franciscan, a former student of mine, Hat Kelly. She painted this picture of Francis, and it's especially the words that I find intriguing. You didn't preach to the birds, you asked for directions. Please, beloved St. Francis, help us ask, help us listen, help us hear, help us act. To me, this really points to that relationality that is attracting so many people today. Thank you.